Pretty sure we finally revealed how Shanks made it to Marineford so quickly. My dude used the Rainbow Bridge. I think that's an amazing idea. The current theory for Shanks' fast travel is that he utilizes the undersea currents, which aren't policed by the Marines or the world government because they're just too dangerous. However, if Shanks does have access to Sunstone technology, which Broggy says is nothing particularly special for them, I guess. For the rest of the world, this is revolutionary, because if Shanks had Sunstone, then this dude is painting rainbows and flying them all over the world. Who's gonna stop him? Just how many pirates or Marines are even capable of sky travel? The answer is almost none. That's why the Thousand Sunny's capabilities are a big deal, and that's why Big News Morgan's is also in such a great position because of his bird balloon, and of course it's why the Vegapunks are currently safe, because they know that they're incredibly unlikely to be found by anyone in the next couple of centuries because they're floating around in the sky. So Shanks using these rainbows could be like him taking a flight where everyone else has to travel by sea. It's such a huge advantage, and it makes stuff like the red line seem like a joke. Because what, it's a big wall, dude, I can paint a rainbow over it, no big deal. Of course, this isn't anywhere near guaranteed, but something that I would love to see by the end of this arc is for the Straw Hats to attain some Sunstone and have the Thousand Sunny travel across the seas by rainbow. Loki must have said something very convincing to make Luffy consider helping him after insulting Shanks. I mean, we do know that they made a deal, which is it's very concerning. And the initial deal that Loki offered was to destroy a pirate crew of Luffy's choosing upon release, which I don't know if that's the kind of thing that Luffy would go for. He's very much more simple-minded. If there is a crew that he does want to beat, then mate, just go off and do it yourself. Remove the middleman. So I have to believe that Loki offered something else. And just like Luffy, it could have been painfully simple. Something like, you free me and I'll give you a ton of delicious giant meat. Which could be a bit of a twist on the typical arc opening where Luffy feeds someone and then decides to put his life on the line for that generosity. So Luffy may have to reckon with the idea that the person who gave him food is somehow not good. Although looking back on the chapter, there is a big sign that the crew should have picked up on, which is when Luffy reunited with them. He said, hey guys, the village is on this level, and no one questioned how Luffy knew that. We know that Luffy knows because Loki told him, but this should have been a huge red flag for the other crew members, because why would Luffy ever know where anything is? To be fair to them, they're probably all just a bit overwhelmed right now. Usopp's way too excited to be on Elbaf in general, and Chopper's clearly sharing that excitement. Sanji is a bit too enamored with Gerd, so if Zoro and Nami aren't paying attention, then mate, everything is hopeless. But back to Loki's original offer, you know what kind of scallywag would take up this destruction deal? That's right, Eustace Kid. He has such a massive grudge against the Red Hair Pirates, and after suffering a second humiliating defeat to them, he really could just say F it and decide to invoke Ragnarok for the sake of taking revenge. I guess the idea being that he could commandeer the key to Loki's cuffs from Luffy, and that would save Luffy from being viewed as the objective bad guy in the situation, because if Luffy does free Loki, then mate, it's gonna be hard to recover from that, unless Loki himself does turn out to be a pretty decent guy, in which case, good job. And I do think that Oda likes to keep Luffy quite pure, so even if he's made a deal that involves freeing Loki, the situation feels primed for some nefarious figure to step in and alter the deal. If not Eustace Kid, then an Orochi or Spandam-like opportunist, so maybe even someone like Road. He's deranged enough to do something like this, and he believes quite strongly in giant supremacy where strength dictates all of existence, so he could very much end up screwing us all over once again. I do suggest you look up Sunstone and what real-life Vikings use it for. Good suggestion, let's do it. So Sunstone is a mineral that is mentioned in medieval Icelandic texts, which is said to have allowed their wielders to locate the sun on an overcast day, as well as even tell the time by using it as something of a sundial. And this was a substance that was said to be so effective that even after the invention of the magnetic compass, Icelandic sailors said nah mate and favored the use of the sunstone. And it's not confirmed, but it is suspected that the actual substance this refers to is Iceland spar, a chunk of which was found in the wreckage of a medieval Icelandic ship in 2002. Although I should say that the alternative theory posed as to why the spar was found is that the sailors were using it as a paperweight. So this could be a case of historians believing that history was much more magical than it really was. Doesn't really matter because Oda has definitely gone down the more magical and adventurous path for his Sunstone, and I like that. I really hope our mystery man isn't Shiki. Alright, this could age horribly, but I am so looking forward to the idea of finally being able to put the Shiki idea to bed. We tuck it in, we say goodnight, and then we smother it with a pillow. There are a lot of people who still insist that this is obviously Shiki because of the colors used in the digitally colored manga, which does mostly match Shiki's design, but the thing to keep in mind is that Oda doesn't choose these colors. The work for these minor characters gets assigned to colorists who are allowed to work at their own discretion, and that's why very few characters in the digitally colored manga are introduced with their actual color schemes. So that's my warning with just assuming that this is Shiki. The colors aren't canon until Oda draws them in person. And of course, I'm hoping that it's not Shiki, but it is still a possibility, especially since we've seen a lot of the animals from Strong World on Elbaf, so that could be a pretty big hint that he's been here the entire time. At the moment, I'm not sure what we'd achieve by reintroducing Shiki of all people though, as opposed to finally getting to meet someone like Scopa, because the other thing we need to remember is that this person was actually friendly with Crocus, and Shiki would have had to have a radical personality overhaul for these sorts of pleasantries to be exchanged. Are we going to talk about Elbaf's third realm, Heaven? Considering the mythology behind the island, what if this is their form of Valhalla? You know, I suppose we could talk about it. It's definitely the realm that I'm currently most keen to see, and if I had to make a prediction, I would say this is probably going to be the place where the final climax of the arc happens. Considering that you've got Loki claiming to be a sun god and Luffy who doesn't claim to be a sun god but just is one anyway, it feels like the most appropriate place for this showdown to happen is Heaven, Valhalla, the realm of the gods, whatever we want to call it. And we have done scenarios like this before, but never quite this literally. The first was Luffy versus Enel in the sky, when we smacked a false god down, but Dressrosa also had quite a similar ending because Luffy defeated Doflamingo in the sky and gave that false deity world noble a taste of delicious crunch some earth. And the other thing to think about is that Elbaf is eventually going to have its own countdown to destruction. Realistically, that probably won't happen until late next year or even 2026, but every arc now has its own island destroying threat that needs to be stopped. Or something similar to Onigashima crashing into the flower capital of Wano, the Buster Call on Egghead, Big Mom's rampage on Totolan, seizes chemical weapon, etc. So maybe the countdown to destruction on Elbaf is going to involve its 3 tiers, and having them gradually engulfed by Ragnarok until everyone's right at the top and there is nowhere left to run. I find it funny that part of Louis Arnaud's review talks about how much of a shame it would be to not explore Elbaf. Almost feels like this review is what convinced Oda to do this arc in the first place. These words do feel like Oda talking to himself. The fact that Louis Arnaud concedes that, it would be a great shame not to visit Elbaf. Because just in case you're not aware, we're not supposed to be here right now. Oda was actually planning on skipping Elbaf and moving forwards. If you want to know more about that, I have a whole video detailing what happened and why. But with this in mind, these words do hit a lot harder, as if Oda is reinforcing himself, saying, yeah, I gotta do this. But then there's also the warning at the end, like, we're gonna do this, but let's not linger too long. That could also be Oda talking to himself. Yes, we're going to visit, but please don't stay too long. We can't afford to have another Wano-length vacation here, because we've got work to do, and I'd like to finish this series sometime this decade. Look, by One Piece standards, it's pretty unlikely that the crew will spend too much time on Elbaf, considering that most arcs are done and dusted in a day or two of in-world time, although there is the exception of Wano where we spent almost a month on that island. But this isn't just Oda trying to give himself a warning or set expectations for the readers. There is an in-world reason why people shouldn't stop at this island for too long. And I've got 2 ideas as to why. One is reasonable and the other is not. The first idea is that this island is so colossal that it may screw with the log pose, and if you don't leave quickly enough, it could render you unable to reach the next island, which may actually tie into the idea of the aforementioned Sunstone, and that might be another reason why giants carry it, to use it for navigational purposes where poses are no longer good enough. But thinking back to Little Garden, this island was a huge problem because it took 1 year for the log pose to reset, and according to Dory and Broggy, no human was able to last that full year on Little Garden. And if we're talking about scaling things up to some sort of big garden, then maybe a reset on Elbaf doesn't take too long from the perspective of a giant, but for a human, the reset could be their entire lifespan, and so you really don't want your tools to be locked into Elbaf's magnetic forces. Although I do admit that a similar thing happening on Elbaf wouldn't feel like a huge problem, because we have so many allies who can help us. The giant warrior pirates, the new giant warrior pirates, we can just set sail with them from anywhere. So that's what brings me to my probably wrong but much more interesting and devastating idea, which is that time passes differently on Elbaf, and each day spent on this island equates to many more days or even more units of measurements beyond that in the outside world. So if you were to spend too much time here, then you could leave to find that the outside world has completely changed. That's the sort of thing that this warning takes my mind to, because a similar concept has been referenced in One Piece before, which is the Tamate box on Fishman Island. This item actually comes from the Urashimatara folktale, where he visited the dragon palace of a mermaid princess, but time passed differently within the palace, and when Urashimatara returned, everyone he knew had grown old and died. And that was the purpose of the Tamate box itself. It was said to store Urashimatara's aging during the time he spent at the dragon palace. He was told never to open it, but of course he did open the box, and all of that age, it ravaged him instantly. So I want to emphasize that this is an unlikely idea and I wouldn't put too much stock into it, but at this stage I'm not quite sure what else would warrant a warning like this, especially for the Straw Hats, because they're realistically strong enough, smart enough, and have enough utility in every field to overcome whatever problems this island could throw at them. And it does bring up some potentially interesting time-related ideas. Firstly, the silhouetted figure. If time passes differently on Elbaf, then this guy could be from the Void Century for all that we know. Secondly, if we did encounter Eustace Kid again, it would be fun for him to have spent a long time from his perspective on this island, maturing and growing more powerful, because it's very possible that Eustace Kid is actually somewhere in the underworld, because what else would they would have done with him? He tried to attack the island, so you know what, mate, he gets punished and imprisoned in the traditional way. Thirdly, time-based shenaniganry could also explain why Shanks took so long to finally take his island back from Bartolomeo, because it took a whole month from the time that Bartolomeo landed there to when Shanks arrived to stop him. So maybe having that drink on Elbaf with a couple of old friends for the afternoon equated to a couple of weeks. And fourthly, I kind of like the idea of time passing differently, because it's a perfect reflection of how slowly time passes in the One Piece world compared to the real world it is that I think we're all in. Because a couple of days in the One Piece story can be years for us, and that could serve as another warning for Oda himself. Let's say he wants to spend a day on Elbaf. Well, we need to take that very seriously, because that one day could be 2 years of real world time. And speaking of, there was another question about that. What makes you think Elbaf will be over in 2 years? Honestly, I'm not convinced that it will be over in 2 years. But from my perspective, 2 years is the minimum length it would need. And I'm mostly thinking about this from a publishing perspective. Talking about One Piece arcs in years is a bit tricky, because different arcs have taken place in different time periods of Oda's workflow. For a shocking example of this, let's compare Dressrosa and Egghead Island, because both of these arcs took approximately the same amount of real world time to complete, which is 2 and a bit years. To be more precise, Dressrosa was a couple of months longer, but not long enough to explain the extreme chapter differential. Because Egghead Island took 2 and a bit years to publish its 68 chapters, whilst Dressrosa took 2.5 years to publish its 102 chapters. So you can see that that's a pretty drastic workflow decrease over time, and that's of course due to the increased breaks for Oda's health as well as his work on other One Piece projects. So that's why I use the 2-year number. Because Elbaf, it's not going to be published at the Dressrosa rate, and if it's the same as the Egghead rate, then we've got 2 years at minimum. The only way this doesn't happen is if Elbaf ends up being around 30 chapters, but I don't know, man. We're already 6 chapters into it, 1/6 of the way to that 30 number, and we are not even close with being done with the setup on what is the largest island we will ever go to. I just don't see 30 chapters being long enough to explore the island itself, just explore, let alone get to know its people, its problems, and solve those problems. So I think that Egghead length is probably our minimum, but if it's a bigger story than Egghead, then we could realistically be looking at 3 or even 4 years. It all really does depend on what Oda wants this arc to be.